When working with sheer fabrics, there's a beautiful sheen to them. When you hang a piece of organza embroidery on your wall, when you watch the light shine through at different angles at different times of the day, those embroidered shapes cast a shadow on the wall. It just all plays with color and light in a really intriguing way. There's the assumption that it's so much harder. And you do have to adjust your technique, and there are things that are challenging about it, but I think once you handle the technique and you know how to adjust the way you're stitching, it's quite beginner friendly and you can create something that is so beautiful. My name is Sarah Godfrey. I am a PhD candidate and an artist and designer. Once you have your design, one of the things I love about organza is how easy it is to transfer your design because the fabric's sheer, so you don't need to put it against a window or a light table. I start by taping my design down to my table using masking tape, and then you can put your fabric directly on top. I like to use a pencil to trace over the design. I've just always felt so comfortable in nature, and I've always loved botanicals, so I would love to focus in on interesting botanical details and figuring out how I can translate that to creating beautiful, very graphic illustrations. The color palette for this design was actually inspired by a beautiful silk scarf that my sister got for me for my birthday. And it had these really beautiful peachy shades. It made me think of early spring and summer when everything is blooming. For some places in this design, you're going to be using 6-ply where the stem is going to look a little bit thicker or the leaves are going to stand out a little bit more. But for smaller areas, I prefer to use the 3-ply because you can be very, very precise and you can hide your starting point and ending point very easily. When you're embroidering on sheer fabric, you may be using the same stitches that you would use on an opaque fabric, but you have to adjust the technique a little bit. Whatever you're doing on the front needs to match on the back because you'll be able to see any little mistake. So you can't just jump around to different areas like you would with an opaque fabric. I avoid the use of knots, for example. So whenever I'm doing a stem stitch, a satin stitch, I always start with a tail that I can hide and then make sure to weave through at the back because all of those little details are going to show through. Along the center line of the sprig, I'm using split stitch, which I really like for organza embroidery because it's quite easy to keep the tail secure as you're going because you end up stitching into your thread. The straight stitches that come out from diagonals from the sprigs, you just have to make sure to return to the center before doing your next diagonal, and sometimes you can weave through from the back, and that hides all the places where you would typically jump around on the back with no problem. The approach with the sprigs is going to be translated a little bit to the other elements as well. Most of the elements on this design involve that central stem line that you're going to begin with and then move to doing the satin stitch leaves. I really like satin stitch for organza because it gives you a larger surface area to be able to hide your thread. So when you're moving through the leaves and you need to return to the center, you simply pass your needle through the middle at the back, and then when you're finished with the final leaf, you just weave through a few times and trim your floss. I find with organza, the satin stitch complements the fabric so beautifully because the floss has a nice sheen to it, so that smooth surface that you create with satin stitch looks very beautiful against the sheen of the organza. Making is so important to me because it's an expression of my identity. And in the world today with social media, you can put that out there and very easily connect with people all over the world who share your interests as well. On the larger leaves, I'm paying attention to the angles. The stitches are going to be moving in different directions, so they're going to hit the light in a different way. I think what I love so much about embroidery and fiber arts is that the age range is so broad, and there's so much history too. I love hearing about other people's stories. It keeps me very inspired, and I feel so happy with myself when I feel like I've inspired somebody else. The head of the other flower uses satin stitch, and what I do with this that's a little bit different from the other shapes that use satin stitch is I complete the look with a back stitch outline, so that helps it to look really clean and gives it a slightly different texture than the other elements in the composition. The spiky flower next to the pom-poms I would say is my second favorite element. I really love that flower because to me I envision it as being the 2D version of the pom-pom. There are 4 stitches on each of the branches along this sprig to give them a slightly different look than the other ones. It also gives you a little bit of extra width to play with so that when you're doing the French knots, it hides your work and keeps it looking really tidy. The French knots add another little raised feature that casts a shadow. So you're building a sense of scale. Then we build ultimately to the height with the pom-poms. I think with all embroidery, the most fascinating part to me is the 3-dimensional aspect. The whole embroidery experience is extremely tactile by nature. You're playing with texture and color all the way through, and it's really interesting and really fun. The pom-pom is my favorite element of this project because it is so fun to create. It adds a lot of height to the design, and the process of creating that pom-pom and giving it a haircut, I think, is the most exciting part of the project. It can be a little bit messy, but I think it's so fun shaping it gradually and creating that really fluffy ball-like texture. I am a perfectionist, but I also move quite quickly. And for me, I love that you can see the artfulness of the human hand. So I like a little bit of imperfection with embroidery. I think it really adds something to it that a machine can't really do. I like your eye to move around to different places and have interest throughout the whole design. So I designed it where your eye is going to dance around and feel really happy throughout the whole composition. I would encourage anyone who loves embroidery to try organza because it's so impactful when you're finished. And once you master some simple techniques to make sure that your work is really neat, there's such a wow factor.